Hello, I'm Ruth Danon, and I am sitting in the beautiful Boulder bookstore where I'm here to talk about my new book, Turn Up the Heat. I'm so grateful and honored to be here. I want to thank the bookstore and Stephanie in particular for inviting me to do this, and I'm going to be answering some questions about my new book.
Can you give us a brief synopsis of your collection?
Yes, I can do that. The book was written, poems in the book were written before, during, and after the pandemic. And right before the pandemic, I went to Sardinia. I mean, literally right before. Like I came home and everything shut down 2 weeks later. And so the book takes up sort of that time period, and in particular in Sardinia, I became interested in two figures. One, the figure of St. Anthony of the Desert. Now, when people hear St. Anthony, they think of St. Anthony of Padua, who is the saint of lost things. But this is not that saint. This is a saint of Anthony of Egypt, who was also a patron saint of hermits, and was said to have taken fire from the devil and brought it into the world, and therefore bring heat into the world. And the other figure that appears in this book and named in this book is Giordano Bruno. And Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake in the Campo dei Fiori in Rome in 1600. He was a heretic. He was someone who not only thought that the sun did not revolve around the earth, but rather the earth revolved around the sun. But he also believed that there were infinite numbers of suns and infinite numbers of earths. And in that way, he was sort of looking far ahead. It was sort of like looking through the Webb telescope, in the late 17th century. In the early 17th century, 1600, so 16th century. So those two figures shaped the book in certain ways. So I've always hated to be cold. So my whole relationship to heat was central to the book. The book does not have a narrative structure. Every book has a different structure. This book was constructed recursively, so the things that appear at the beginning appear towards the end. And I actually have a poem that begins, I'm not going to read it today, but it's a poem towards the end of the book that states quite directly, it's kind of an ars poetica, that says, let's say that life has no plot. In some sense, this book has no plot either. But it tries to take us through a series of emotional experiences. So some of the poems deal with long marriage. That's a third figure in the book, is the husband. Some of it deals with the kind of isolation that COVID put us all in. But I like to think of it as a book that surprises the reader, so that when you turn the page, you can't predict what's going to happen next. Or the things that occur early on, wishes that are expressed early on, get dealt with later on in the book. That's the best way I could answer that. So it doesn't have a plot.
Mm-hmm. And what inspired you to put this collection together right now?
Well, I had a whole mess of poems. I didn't know what to do with them. I had no idea what to do with them. So I do what I always do, which is I got help. I went to my editor, who is a wonderful poet, David Groff, and I said, David, do I have a book here? Do I have anything here? And he said, yes. You read it? And he said, yeah, you have a book, and these are some of the things that I see. And I thought, okay. And so then I went home and I started ordering the book. And once he told me I had a book, it was very easy to do what I just described, which is to sort of take these ideas that appeared in the book and sort of shape them in this recursive fashion. And then I sent the book to him, and he said, well, it's almost there, but you need more Bruno. And he said, that's going to be hard for you because you don't tend to write intentionally. So I went and wrote more poems involving Bruno. So that's how it came together, and it was inspired by this. I'm working on a memoir, and I thought I can't finish the memoir until I get these poems out of the way. because they're haunting me, and I don't know what to do with them. And if they're no good and I have to throw them away, that's fine, but I can't just have them sit around being nothing.
What kind of research did you do to write about the historical figures that feature in your poetry?
I had always been interested in Bruno. He was somehow a figure in my family that was sort of, I don't know, always regarded with a great deal of respect and admiration. So I had read about him. And then I also took, during the pandemic, I took a course taught by the local rabbi in heresy. So I was sort of interested in heretical thought and what the relationship is between heresy and conformity. So that was another form of research. And then I was in Sardinia, and in Sardinia they are all completely involved with St. Anthony of the Desert. And I happened to be there on his feast day, and on his feast day they create these fires, these huge fires. They're mounds that are bigger than a house, and then there's a living tree that comes up from the mound. And I looked at that, and I immediately made the association to the statue of Giordano Bruno in the Campo di Fiori. And so the two things came together, and then I just started reading about St. Anthony of the Desert. I read legends about him. I wouldn't say that I overly researched the book, but I did research in different ways. I experienced things. I looked up things. I had lived with things for a long time. I took a course. So that whole constellation of ideas and experiences influenced the book.
Have you always hated or feared the cold, or is that something that came to you a bit later?
I've always hated the cold. Always. My mother hated the cold too. But I think there's a little more to it than that. I grew up on the grounds of a mental hospital where my mother was a psychiatrist, and that's the memoir that I'm writing. And so the hospital had its own power plant, and it produced enormous quantities of heat. And so I grew up in these intensely overheated environments. So anything that wasn't overheated just felt cold to me. And then there's all the metaphoric stuff about cold and coldness, coldness in the world and coldness in people and coldness in myself. It sort of interests me as a metaphor as well. But no, I've always hated the cold. And actually, what's really funny is that I have more tolerance for cold than I used to. And that's partly because somebody once said to me, there's no such thing as bad weather, there's just bad clothes.
Fair enough. Can you tell us about how you go about writing a poem?
Oh boy. I never know what I'm going to write, so I never write from intention, except for the few Bruno things that my editor told me to do. I don't know, I get a line. Well, I keep a notebook, and in the notebook I write a lot of nonsense. I write the weather, I write, about the cats, I write that I'm mad at my husband. I write all this stuff. And then eventually, I don't know, a line comes to me, or an image, or something I see, and I write it down, and then the opening line gives me the opening to the poem. And for a long time, off and on, I've done something called the grind, which is a little, thing created by this guy in the South somewhere. And they sign up for a month, and you agree to write something every day. And you share it with a little pod of people. There's no feedback, there's no crosstalk, it's nothing. You just commit to sending these things in. And I wrote a lot of stuff that way. I wasn't always a good grinder. I sometimes wouldn't write for the whole month, but that was also good. But I never know what I'm going to write before I write it. Never, ever.
All right. What are a couple of books you've read recently that you really loved?
Oh boy. I would say the book of poetry that stands out for me was a Diane Seuss sonnets, Frank sonnets, which is a terrific book, just a really terrific book. So I really like that. I'm a very eclectic reader. I read a lot of things. So I just finished reading Ruth Ben-Ghiat's book about strong men called Strong Men, which is about dictators and how they come to power and how they leave power. Fascinating book. I'm reading a novel, The Maniac, which I've just started, which is gorgeous. And I also love mysteries and spy stories. I actually am working on a series of poems that involve spies. So I've been reading the Slow Horses series. That's for the airplane. So those are some things. I read very widely and very eclectically, and not as much as I should, because I spend a lot of time teaching. So teaching takes an enormous amount of my time.
Is there anything else you want us to know about your book?
Well, I hope you'll be interested in it. No, I'm proud of this book. I guess that's what I'd want to say. And it's my fourth. And I think it's the best of my books. And I think that one of the things about it is that while it deals with pretty complicated ideas, it's written in a way that's extremely accessible. It's also funny. There are parts of the book that are just flat out funny. If you like cats, there are a number of cats that appear in the book. I never write about, this is what happened to me last Tuesday. So if you want to know about my breakfast, you won't find it in the book. Does that cover it?
Sounds good. All right, last question. Can you read us a poem from your book?
Sure. I'm going to read one of the Bruno poems, Anthony Bruno poems. It's one that comes later in the book. There's another one on the same subject that occurs in the beginning of the book, but it's much longer. This one, I think, is more subjectively constructed, whereas the first one lays out a lot of the facts about Anthony and Bruno so that the reader is oriented to those characters. But this is called St. Anthony's Fire. Rosemary, cork, oak myrtle, sweet eucalyptus, pine branches upon fir branches, a mound piled taller than I am, taller than the house I live in, and from the center one living tree, bare of branches, proud as Giordano Bruno in a Campo dei Fiori, a man tall and cowled. They burned him for thinking too much of infinite earth, every star a sun. In Galtali, in the center of town, they light the fire slowly. It starts to burn, one side bright, one side shadow, always and in all things, one side bright and one side shadow. And now I must go, they say, 3 times around the fire, until I sweat like the devil in the heat, and I taste the first fist of hot ash in my bitten mouth.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to talk here and to share my book with you.